Hello, and welcome to the Spicy Pod Sleep Stories. I am Michael, and tonight you will witness a storm that traps two hearts together, where desire simmers and restraint teeters on the edge. They have been resisting a connection that started months ago, flared on New Year's Eve, and now can no longer be contained. In a snowbound resort, every brush of a hand, lingering glance, and stolen moment will test their limits, revealing a slow burn tension, playful dominance, and intimacy that refuses to stay hidden. The storm had arrived quietly, as if it had been waiting for the noise to end. 3 days after New Year's Eve, the resort no longer glittered with celebration. The fireworks were gone, the music packed away, the champagne flutes cleared from the lounges. What remained was snow, thick, unbroken, falling with a patience that felt deliberate. Victoria Hale stood near the tall windows of the main atrium, a porcelain cup warming her palms as she watched the white world erase itself again and again. Pines bent under the weight of it, paths vanished within minutes. Somewhere beyond the trees, rails lay buried, and roads had ceased to matter. An announcement drifted through the space, calm and practiced. All outbound trains are delayed until further notice. Road conditions remain unsafe. No one sounded surprised anymore. Around her, the resort breathed with quiet life. This place was massive, designed to absorb crowds without ever feeling full. Even now, dozens of guests moved through its wide corridors and open lounges, and among them were people she knew too well. Colleagues, board members, senior managers, entire teams who had come here under the neat pretense of a company retreat that happened to coincide with the holidays. Victoria felt their presence even when she didn't see them, a nod across the lobby, a polite greeting near the elevators, familiar laughter drifting from a distant bar. The company never really left her, not even here, not even now. She turned as footsteps approached, already aware of who it would be. Noah Reyes stopped a few paces away, as if distance were still something they both believed in. He looked different outside the office. Everyone did. No tailored suits, no conference rooms, no glass walls reflecting hierarchy back at them. He wore a dark sweater, sleeves pushed up, hair still damp from the cold. Relaxed, unguarded, and somehow more dangerous for it. "Looks like we're not going anywhere," he said, voice low, almost conversational. "Looks that way," Victoria replied evenly. They stood side by side, not touching, their reflections faint in the glass. From a distance, they could have been anyone. Two professionals inconvenienced by weather. Nothing about them invited suspicion. Someone passed behind them, a familiar face, a brief glance that lingered half a second too long. Victoria felt it immediately, the instinct to straighten, to step away, to remember who she was in this room. Noah must have felt it too. His posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The space between them widened by inches, just enough. This had been happening for months, not the storm, not the delay, the restraint. It had started quietly, the way these things always did. A look held too long across a conference table. Late nights, when the office emptied, and neither of them seemed eager to be first to leave. A moment in the elevator when the doors closed, and something unspoken pressed in with the silence. She had told herself it was nothing. He was younger. Brilliant, yes, but new. Promising in a way that made people lean forward when he spoke. Dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with ambition. New Year's Eve had tested that resolve. She remembered the balcony, the cold air, fireworks tearing the sky open while the crowd inside counted down. The way he had stood close then, too close, and how easily she had let it happen, because everyone was watching something else. They hadn't crossed a line that night. They had only stepped right up to it. Now the days after stretched ahead of them, quiet and uncelebrated. Breakfast taken at odd hours, long afternoons with nowhere to be, snowfall thick enough to slow time itself, and everywhere they went, there were others, eyes that noticed, corridors that echoed, shared spaces that demanded composure. Victoria took a slow sip of her coffee and let her gaze return to the snow. This place is going to start feeling very small, she said. Noah's mouth curved. Not a smile exactly. More an acknowledgement. It already is. Another group entered the atrium then. Voices carrying boots shedding snow. The moment broke cleanly, as it always did. Noah inclined his head. Professional, distant again. "I'll see you at the briefing," he said. Of course he would. As he walked away, Victoria remained by the window, pulse steady, expression calm. Anyone watching would see nothing more than a CEO weathering an inconvenience. But beneath that composure, something else had begun to stir. Quiet, insistent, no longer willing to wait for interruptions to pass. Outside, the snow kept falling. Victoria Hale moved through the corridors of the resort with the same precision she used to navigate boardrooms. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floors, but she barely registered the sound. Her mind was elsewhere, wandering through months of half smiles, lingering glances, and unspoken exchanges. Noah Reyes had been in the company less than a year, yet somehow the tension between them had started the moment he walked into her office with a pitch deck clutched in one hand, and quiet confidence in every gesture. She recalled that afternoon vividly. He had leaned forward over the table, explaining his plan in a calm, deliberate tone. His hand brushed hers while pointing at a chart. She'd felt it instantly, the spark that refused to be ignored. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, and she had not pulled away. Neither had acknowledged it, but both had felt the same pulse of something sharp and electric. She shook her head slightly, trying to shake the memory, but it clung. The storm outside mirrored her thoughts, white and unrelenting. Later, during New Year's Eve, when the company's retreat had reached its crescendo, the sparks had reignited. Everyone had crowded the main hall with laughter, champagne glasses, and fireworks. Amid the celebrations, they had found each other, almost by accident, or perhaps not at all. She remembered the balcony, cold, crisp air biting at her cheeks, the city's lights reflected in snow beyond the trees. He had been there first, casually leaning on the railing, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the fireworks. She had joined him, claiming nothing, yet standing too close. The space between them had been electric. Neither had acted on it. Not then. Not in front of anyone. They had kept their restraint, and yet both knew the truth. How easily the distance could have been erased if not for the crowd, the lights, the expectation. Now, days later, they were trapped in the quiet after the storm. No celebrations to distract them. No reason to pretend they didn't feel the pull. But the presence of others in the resort still kept their gestures measured. In every shared lounge, in every hallway, there were colleagues. People from the company who could, without realizing, witness the subtle exchanges that meant more than words. Victoria found herself in the library, supposedly seeking a quiet moment to work on strategy notes. She caught a glimpse of Noah across the room. He was crouched by the large window, looking out at the storm, notebook in hand. Even without the boardroom, the casual sweater and jeans, he radiated a quiet authority. Not hers, not yet, but the kind that unsettled her just by existing. She reminded herself of office moments she couldn't forget. The time he had stayed late to finish a presentation and she had walked past his desk, stopping just long enough to adjust a loose cable, her fingers brushing his arm. Or when he had corrected her on a technical detail, calm, insistent, and somehow utterly compelling. She had bristled at the interruption, yet she had also been drawn to it. Noah shifted then, glancing her way. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow to a corridor of unspoken acknowledgement. Neither moved first. Neither spoke. A colleague passed behind him, forcing them both to reset, to pull back into professionalism. Victoria could feel the small tightness in her chest. As the tension coiled and released itself, invisible to anyone else. The snow outside fell relentlessly, blanketing everything in white, giving the resort an intimacy it hadn't earned. The storm had reduced the world to silence, and in that silence, Victoria felt the unrelenting awareness of him, of Noah, looming closer than propriety allowed. Even as she worked, she caught herself thinking of the almost moments they'd had, the brush of his hand on hers during a team exercise, the near kiss on New Year's Eve, the way he had watched her from across the boardroom with those dark eyes that never blinked first. Every memory was sharp, vivid, and slightly dangerous. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and she shivered, not from cold. Noah stepped closer, casually, as if coincidence governed their proximity. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the air between them seemed charged. Her pulse reacted before her mind could assess. She resisted the urge to step back, though the presence of the cleaning staff rounding the corner reminded her to behave. She had learned restraint long ago in the office. She could do it again. And yet, even as she reminded herself, she felt the tension creeping back, slower, more deliberate, insisting on attention. He spoke, finally, his voice low, a quiet disruption in the library's hushed atmosphere. "Are you actually working, or just hiding from the storm?" Victoria allowed herself the smallest smirk, tightening her grip on her notebook. "A bit of both." He moved past, leaving the faintest scent of cologne, the warmth of proximity, and a pulse she could still feel long after his departure. And as he walked away, the truth settled around her like snow, the sparks they'd been resisting. Since the office, since New Year's Eve, were no longer something that could be ignored, not in the quiet, not here. The storm outside would continue for hours, and so would they. The memory came to Victoria Hale like a pulse, sharp, undeniable, and entirely unwelcome in its persistence. She could see it all clearly. The lights, the laughter, the way the resort had glittered with celebration, as if the world itself were turning for them alone. It had started in the main hall, crowded with colleagues, company leadership, and clients who had come for networking rather than revelry. She had moved through it with her usual composure, heels clicking over polished floors, eyes scanning the crowd, mind focused on the small details that always mattered: the flow of drinks, the schedule of speeches, the placement of staff. Nothing about the chaos fazed her, except for him. Noah Reyes had been there too. He moved easily through the crowd, unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. He never shouted over the music or sought attention. His presence demanded it. Every glance he gave, every subtle adjustment of posture, seemed calculated to draw her focus without saying a word. Victoria remembered the moment when the fireworks began. Everyone cheered, glasses raised, voices blending into the roar of the crowd. She had stepped outside to the balcony, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders against the chill. The night air smelled of snow and smoke and something electric she couldn't name. And he was there. He had stepped onto the balcony a few seconds after her, unhurried, calm. There had been no words at first, only the wind, the snow dusting the railings, the faint scent of pine, and his cologne, subtle but intoxicating. "Too loud," he said finally, voice low, almost a murmur. Not a complaint, just observation. Victoria had turned slightly, caught in the look he gave her, composed, confident, controlled. A young man who had no reason to be here, yet somehow owned this moment as much as she did. "I prefer it this way," she replied, carefully measured. Her tone was smooth, professional. Her heart beat faster than she admitted. The space between them had been minimal, inches that felt like miles in terms of restraint. His gaze lingered too long, attentive to her movements, the slight twitch of a smile she thought she hid. She had tried to look away, tried to focus on the distant fireworks, but the weight of him pressed insistently in her mind. There had been a spark in the office months before, hands brushing while passing documents, a word too intimate in tone, the way he had leaned closer during late-night strategy sessions. She had resisted every time, pride and experience guiding her carefully away. But that spark had not died. It had smoldered, waiting for an opening. New Year's Eve had been it. A gust of wind made her hair whip across her face, and he reached out with one hand, brushing it back. It was a simple motion, deliberate, commanding, and it drew her attention entirely. Her pulse had spiked despite herself. "You shouldn't," she had whispered, more to the wind than him. "Shouldn't what?" His voice carried warmth, control, quiet dominance. "Stand so close." He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curved, teasing but controlled. "You don't want me to?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The admission hovered in her chest like a weight she wasn't ready to bear. And for a moment, just a moment, the world narrowed to him and her. Balcony and snowfall, fireworks above, and the storm of desire they had been hiding for months. Then footsteps echoed inside, the celebration, the music, the crowd returning to check the balcony, to see what the evening held. They stepped apart, just enough to avoid notice. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the interruption, and she straightened, brushing snow from her coat as if it were nothing. But neither forgot. The night stretched on. Drinks were refilled. Colleagues chattered. To the outside world, she remained composed, a CEO in command. He remained the promising newcomer, brilliant, observant, invisible to everyone who didn't look too closely. But the almost moment lingered, electric and unyielding. By the end of New Year's Eve, neither had acted on it. No kiss had landed. No hand had lingered more than necessary. Yet both had walked away, knowing the truth. The restraint was unbearable, and the pull was inevitable. Now, days later, trapped by snow, by delayed trains, by roads rendered useless, they were left in silence with nothing to distract them. The sparks that had refused to die were free to burn, slowly, deliberately, almost painfully. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, recalling the brush of his hand, the tilt of his head, the quiet, commanding tone that had unsettled her more than any boardroom argument or high-stakes negotiation ever could. and she realized it had never been just New Year's Eve. It had been the months before, the small touches, the unsaid words, the calculated glances that had built between them. That night had only confirmed it. The storm outside raged on, heavy and relentless, just as the storm inside her, the one that followed him wherever he went, would not be denied. When she opened her eyes, Noah was gone from her line of sight, probably attending to colleagues or slipping unnoticed through the lounge. But the space he left behind throbbed with the memory of his presence, and a subtle tension she could neither name nor ignore pulled tight in her chest. The days after, the snowbound days, were going to test them in ways New Year's Eve had only hinted at, and neither would be able to hide. The storm had settled into a rhythm relentless and unyielding, as if the mountains themselves conspired to hold them here. Roads remained impassable, trains delayed indefinitely, and the resort, a sprawling, modern complex designed to absorb hundreds, felt both immense and intimate under the weight of the falling snow. Victoria Hale moved through the corridors with deliberate composure. She was still the CEO, still in command, but every step, every glance was measured now with attention she couldn't name aloud. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside, white, endless, and pressing. Noah Reyes appeared suddenly at the top of the grand staircase, hands tucked casually in the pockets of his dark coat. Even in isolation, he exuded authority, confidence that needed no room to expand. He didn't approach her, at least not yet, but the air between them was charged. "Plans for the day?" she asked, voice calm, measured. He tilted his head, eyes catching hers with a faint, unreadable expression. "Depends. Are you hiding in the library again, or taking the executive suite for yourself?" She allowed herself the smallest smirk, but her pulse thumped faster than she cared to admit. "Neither. I'm surveying the storm." He stepped closer, deliberately but not aggressively, enough to occupy the space between them, enough to test her reactions. She felt it immediately, the subtle heat of proximity, the impossibility of ignoring him, even in a room crowded with others who could see, who might notice, because they were not entirely alone. The resort still had guests, some from their company, scattered teams taking advantage of the extended holiday. Polite nods in passing, brief smiles, a waiter lingering near the bar. All were reminders that restraint was still necessary. And yet, every time someone else moved past, it forced them to pull back only slightly, and the tension accumulated like snowdrifts outside. In the lounge, she found him again, leaning against a tall window that framed the storm, notebook in hand. The room was quiet. A few colleagues scattered around, absorbed in conversation or devices. Victoria seated herself across from him at the low table, coffee in hand, trying to maintain professional distance. "You've been here too long," she said lightly, though her gaze lingered on him. "I could say the same," he replied, voice low, "or maybe I'm exactly where I need to be." That tone, calm, confident, and slightly possessive, made her shiver despite herself. She looked down at her cup, willing her pulse to slow. He moved a fraction closer, almost imperceptibly. Their knees brushed beneath the table. Neither flinched. Both felt the spark that had begun months ago in the office, and now could no longer be denied. A colleague passed behind them, glancing briefly their way. Both shifted, pulling back just enough to appear ordinary, casual. A shared glance said more than words ever could. The restraint remained for now. Later, Victoria moved to the balcony for air, snow dusting the railings, wind biting at her cheeks. Noah appeared again, as if he had been waiting. This time, he did not speak at first. He simply stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her coat. "You're thinking about it," he said, finally, voice quiet. "What?" she asked, though she knew he didn't need clarification. "Everything, the spark, the rest of it." She swallowed, maintaining a careful calm. "It's nothing," she said, though the lie felt weak even to her own ears. "Is it?" His hand brushed briefly along hers as he leaned against the railing, not lingering, not gentle, just enough to claim the space. The touch sent a ripple through her she couldn't contain. She had tried to resist months ago, tried again on New Year's Eve. Now the storm forced them together, and every minor contact became a statement. A shout from inside broke the moment. Guests calling for staff, laughter drifting from the main hall. They separated immediately, straightening posture, hiding the tension that refused to dissipate. Yet in the quiet that returned, neither could pretend it was nothing. Every glance, every accidental brush, every step in proximity built the inevitable. Victoria felt it in the tightening of her chest, the heat in her pulse, the subtle ache of wanting without permission. Noah felt it too, quiet and controlled, dominance simmering just below the surface. Both knew they were closer than they should be, but the isolation, the storm, the blanketed white world outside left them little choice. The storm would not end tonight, neither would the tension. And for the first time, Victoria realized that the restraint they had held for months, the office glances, the almost moments, the polite distance, was beginning to crack. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she wanted to see. The resort had begun to feel smaller, though in reality it was vast. The storm's rhythm made the world outside disappear entirely, yet inside, Victoria Hale felt the space tighten around her, not because of walls or people or furniture, but because of him. Noah Reyes moved through the lounge, with that same quiet authority, his presence claiming space effortlessly. Every movement, every glance seemed designed to test the boundaries they had kept for months. And Victoria felt them being tested with every heartbeat. They were alone in the moment, technically. The resort's vast corridors made privacy possible, but not absolute. Now and then, someone passed, a colleague retrieving a forgotten coat, a waiter adjusting a chair. Each interruption forced a momentary withdrawal of intent, a careful reset, and yet the tension rebuilt instantly, like snow drifting back over freshly cleared paths. Victoria found herself on the balcony again, this time wrapped in a thick scarf, trying to convince herself she was merely enjoying the view. The truth was that she was waiting for him, for the inevitability of proximity, for the tension that had simmered in the office, carried through New Year's Eve, and now demanded acknowledgement. He stepped out silently, and the space between them immediately became a charged field. Neither spoke at first. Snow dusted their coats, the wind tugged at hair and scarves. And then, quietly, he leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers, not by accident, not by chance. Her pulse spiked. She turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, and in that moment, everything they had held back, the months of restraint, the almost touches in conference rooms, the sparking glances in elevators, became undeniable. "Do you even try anymore?" he asked, low and controlled. His voice held command, expectation, and a challenge all at once. "I try," she said, though the lie felt thin. A pause, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Clearly not hard enough. The brush of his hand on hers was deliberate, claiming, not gentle, not asking. Her fingers tightened instinctively around the railing as her mind fought to remember composure, but the storm outside, the isolation, the thickening silence, they left no room for restraint that felt natural anymore. They moved inside, guided by the necessity of warmth, pretending the shift in proximity was accidental. In the lounge, he was again at her side, close enough that the brush of arms and knees became a statement neither dared speak aloud. His dominance was subtle, silent, a presence that told her without words that he controlled the rhythm of the space they shared. And yet, there were moments that broke the surface. A glance that lingered too long across the sofa, fingers brushing along the edge of a coffee cup, deliberate and teasing, the faint press of his body as he guided her through a crowded hallway. Each contact was brief, almost accidental in appearance, but neither could mistake the intent. Then came the near kisses. In the library, late afternoon, the storm muffling the world outside, they stood across a table. A notebook lay between them, but the space had shifted. His eyes captured hers, unwavering. He leaned slightly forward. She matched him. Closer, closer. Their lips hovered close enough to feel breath mingling in the frozen air. And then someone appeared in the doorway, a colleague, laughing, oblivious. They snapped apart, composed, professional, yet inside, every nerve fired with want. "I swear," Victoria murmured once the hallway cleared, "if anyone else walks in, I might not survive." He smirked, dark and calculated. "Then we'll just have to be careful." Careful. The word was almost meaningless. They both knew it. The rest of the evening became a delicate dance of restraint and escalation. Touches and glances, brief but deliberate, exchanged in public spaces where someone could notice. When alone, the tension became sharper, heavier, almost unbearable, yet neither admitted anything. Neither moved fully into the desire that pressed against them like the storm itself. By the time they returned to their rooms, exhaustion pressed in. Not from the snow, not from the storm, but from the months of restraint, the tension of New Year's Eve, and the unbearable closeness of the past few days. And yet, even behind closed doors, neither could relax fully. Both knew the line they had crossed, or were about to cross, was only the beginning. The fire burned, steady and warm, an echo of the slow, smoldering fire between them. They had crossed the line before, and they would cross it again. The snowstorm had become relentless, draping the resort in an unbroken sheet of white. Wind rattled the windows, gusts sending flurries across the balconies and terraces. The world outside had vanished, and inside, the resort seemed suspended in a quiet, isolated bubble. Victoria Hale leaned against the window of the lounge, watching the snow swirl in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost hypnotic. She could feel the tension in her chest, the pulse of it that had been simmering for months, now impossible to ignore. The storm outside had stripped away distractions. Now there was only him. Noah Reyes appeared from the shadows of the far corner, as if summoned by the quiet. He moved with the same calm confidence, deliberate and unhurried, filling the space without speaking. Every step, every glance drew her attention as though gravity itself had shifted in his direction. "You should be working," she said lightly, attempting composure, though the tightness in her chest betrayed her. He didn't move closer immediately, but the air between them thickened. "And miss the storm." His voice was low, measured, carrying the subtle dominance she had learned to recognize. Control without apology, authority without force. Her pulse quickened. She had tried restraint all these days, in the lounge, on the balconies, even in the crowded corridors where colleagues passed. But the storm had changed the rules. There was no escape, no distractions, no audience except each other. He stepped closer, closing the distance until the heat of his body brushed against hers. not gentle, not apologetic, deliberate. She stiffened, instinctively resisting, but her resistance was weaker than it should have been. "Victoria," he murmured, leaning just enough that she could feel his breath warm against her cheek. "You've been holding back too long." She began, but the word caught in her throat. She realized, with a jolt, that there was no argument left. He reached for her hand, brushing it lightly against his own. Not a gentle touch. There was purpose, dominance, an unmistakable claim, but brief enough to leave her wanting more. Her fingers tightened instinctively around his, but she did not pull away. A gust of wind rattled the windows. In the sudden hush that followed, they were aware of everything. The storm, the fire burning low in the lounge, and the pulse between them, undeniable and consuming. He leaned closer again, brushing a strand of hair from her face, not stopping when his fingers lingered just a moment too long. The subtle intimacy of it made her shiver. She could feel the sharp contrast of his dominance and her restrained desire in every small, deliberate movement. "You've been trying to resist," he said softly, voice low and commanding, "for months, and yet here you are." She could only swallow, her pulse racing, the tension inside her reaching a point that had been building since the office, since New Year's Eve, since the first sparks she had tried to ignore. He tilted his head slightly, gaze unwavering, assessing her. The next movement was deliberate and precise, the slow, teasing brush of his lips against the side of her neck. Not a kiss meant to satisfy, but to claim the moment, to make her pulse spike and heart race. She leaned forward instinctively, though her mind screamed restraint. "Please stop," she whispered, voice uneven, though her body betrayed her words. Wait, he didn't stop. Not immediately. He drew back just enough to give her a moment of control, but not release. Not entirely. Every step, every brush, every almost kiss, pressed against the tension they had both maintained for months. The storm outside roared, echoing the tempest inside them. When someone moved along the corridor, they snapped apart, instantly pulling back into composure with seamless precision. But the fire of their desire had been lit too brightly to extinguish. Every brush of a hand, every fleeting touch, every glance exchanged in the quiet moments became sharper, heavier, unavoidable. By the time the lounge cleared and the storm's gusts softened to a steady hum, Victoria knew one thing: restraint had become impossible, and Noah Reyes, the young, brilliant, quietly dominant man who had tested her patience for months, would not let it go any longer. The storm was peaking outside. Inside, the tension was absolute, and neither of them could deny what had been waiting to happen for far too long. The storm had softened into a steady snowfall, blanketing the resort in a quiet hush. Outside, The world was white, infinite, and serene. Inside, the tension between Victoria Hale and Noah Reyes had become unbearable, a current that refused to be denied. They were alone in one of the resort's upper lounges, the fire low and warm, flickering against the walls. The space felt intimate, private, though the resort still held other guests. For once, proximity and circumstance granted them a rare freedom. Freedom that had been building for months and refused to wait any longer. Noah stepped closer, and this time, he didn't stop. Not just a brush, not a test. He claimed the space between them fully. The heat of his presence pressed against her, the authority of his dominance clear in every measured step. Victoria's pulse raced, her chest tight with anticipation, desire, and an ache she had tried to ignore since the office. "Victoria," he murmured, voice low, resonant, commanding yet intimate. He reached for her hand, this time holding it, fingers intertwined, his touch deliberate but not harsh. The restraint that had defined him for months. Careful, teasing, controlled, shifted subtly. He gave just enough softness to make the intensity of his dominance even more electric. Her breath hitched. She tried to step back to regain composure, but the warmth of his hand, the strength in his presence, and the quiet command in his gaze held her in place. For the first time, she felt safe, surrendering to the tension rather than fighting it. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, lingering just enough for her to feel the pulse of him. His lips followed, barely touching hers at first, a promise rather than fulfillment. She shivered, caught between restraint and desire, and instinctively leaned forward. His dominance remained, firm and unyielding, yet the touch was gentler now, a careful exploration rather than a test. Neither spoke, letting the unspoken desires convey themselves through proximity, through breath, through every subtle movement. A hand brushed along her waist. She responded instinctively, leaning into him despite herself. Another touch along her shoulder elicited a shiver she could not hide. Every moment was charged, every contact a careful dance on the edge of inevitability, and still they paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. The resort was not entirely empty. Footsteps occasionally echoed in distant corridors, reminding them to temper their boldness. Yet each time, when alone again, the tension resumed, stronger, sharper, and undeniable. Noah's lips pressed against hers again, more insistently this time, a slow, deliberate kiss that conveyed everything they had restrained for months. Victoria responded, allowing herself to feel, to melt into the moment, though neither spoke. Words were unnecessary, the months of restraint, the electric glances, all of it had culminated in this. Finally, he drew back slightly, resting his forehead against hers. His hand slid along her arm, then lingered at her wrist, a quiet declaration of possession and gentleness intertwined. "I've wanted this for too long," he admitted, voice low, almost a whisper. Dominance remained, but it had softened, transformed into something intimate, protective, and irresistible. Victoria's pulse slowed just enough to think, just enough to smile faintly, though her chest still raced. "I've been waiting," she whispered, acknowledging the months of tension, the restraint, and the spark that had persisted despite everything. Outside, the storm continued its gentle fall, blanketing the world in quiet white. Inside, they stood together, finally allowing the tension to transform into something mutual, something undeniable. The restraint, the teasing, the controlled dominance. They had endured it all, and now, at last, it found release in gentle touches, lingering kisses, and quiet acknowledgement of what had been inevitable from the start. The fire flickered, snow whispered against the windows, and in the hush of the resort, they found themselves fully present, fully aware, and fully together, dominance tempered with gentleness, desire finally allowed to breathe. For Victoria and Noah, the snowbound days had brought more than isolation. They had brought clarity, release, and the realization that some sparks once ignited could not be contained. And as the quiet night settled around them, they remained there, together, neither needing words, both understanding that what had begun months ago had finally found its moment. The snow had softened into a quiet, steady drift by the morning of the third day. The resort was wrapped in white, serene, and almost suspended in time. Outside, the world was still hidden beneath heavy blankets, but inside, the quiet hum of the lodge was slowly waking with activity. Few guests moved about, most content to watch the snow fall, sip coffee, or linger by the fire. Victoria Hale stirred in her suite, tracing the patterns of frost along the window. The events of the past days played in her mind. The storm, the enforced isolation, the tension that had finally transformed into something mutual, electric, and undeniably real. She smiled faintly, recalling the gentle dominance in Noah's touch, the way he had taken the lead but allowed softness to follow. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," she called, voice calm though her pulse quickened slightly. Noah stepped inside, coat dusted with snow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Even in the subdued light of morning, he carried that same confident presence that had drawn her in from the very start. "Coffee?" he asked, nodding toward the tray she had prepared. "Already here," she replied. Her tone was light, casual, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Though I imagine you'll want something stronger before the day truly begins." He leaned against the door frame, eyes meeting hers. "Perhaps, Or perhaps I'll just drink this in, he said, gesturing toward the space between them. There was no teasing, no restraint in his gaze now, only quiet confidence, tempered with gentleness. Victoria laughed softly, the sound mingling with the fire's crackle. You're incorrigible. Only when it matters, he said, stepping closer. Their shoulders brushed, fingers occasionally grazing. Each contact was deliberate, intimate, and teasing, yet careful enough to retain the playful tension that had become their signature. They moved through the morning in a rhythm that felt natural. Coffee in hand, snow falling outside, the resort nearly empty but still alive with soft activity. Even with others occasionally passing in hallways or on balconies, they navigated their proximity with a mixture of boldness and subtlety. A glance, a brush of fingers, a gentle press of shoulder to shoulder. Each moment reaffirmed what they had begun to explore fully the day before. At lunch, they found a quiet corner of the main dining hall. Most guests were content to remain at separate tables, and the occasional colleague passing by only added to the thrill of restraint, now mixed with comfort. Noah reached across the table once, brushing his hand lightly against hers as they spoke. It was a casual gesture, yet electric, filled with both dominance and the gentleness he had finally allowed himself. Do you think the storm will ever end? She asked, more to the snow outside than to him. Does it matter? He replied, eyes catching hers. We've been given this time. I'd say it's exactly as it should be. The quietude of the afternoon allowed them moments of private intimacy, sitting near the windows, watching the snow swirl, walking along empty corridors with only occasional glimpses of other guests, lingering touches that spoke volumes without words. Victoria found herself relaxing in ways that had been impossible before, trusting him, surrendering to the tension transformed into something gentle, something mutual, something entirely theirs. Even as evening approached and the fire in the lounge burned lower, they remained side by side. A final moment of quiet intimacy, his hand brushing her hair, hers tracing the edge of his sleeve. A glance, a shared smile, a wordless acknowledgement that the months of restraint, the New Year's Eve spark, the storm-bound isolation had led to this. Victoria and Noah moved through the last hours of their snowbound days with a delicate intimacy, dominance softened by gentleness, desire tempered by care, and the slow burn tension finally resolved into something enduring, quiet, and deeply satisfying. And when the storm finally began to ease, when the world outside showed signs of returning to motion, they were no longer restrained. They had surrendered fully and completely to the connection that had started long before, and had survived the snowbound days to flourish in quiet intimacy. Snow still fell, the world still white and soft, and inside the lodge the story of them remained, intense, private, and quietly infinite. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's story. Good night and sweet dreams